From the newsroom of Impact Alpha, I'm Brian Walsh, and this is your Impact Briefing for Friday, October 29th. I'm heading to Glasgow for COP26, so I've enlisted our roundtable regulars to help me prepare for what is being billed as the most important global climate summit since at least Paris in 2015. Imogen Rose-Smith is an Impact Alpha contributing editor. Hi, Imogen.
Hi, Brian.
And David Bank is Impact Alpha's editor-in-chief. Hi, David.
Hey, Brian. Hey, Imogen.
But before we dig into that conversation, here's what you need to know from this week in impact investing. The pandemic has spurred innovation in healthcare around the world. One example of an emergency need turned long-term solution is Oxygen Hub, which helps local entrepreneurs in Africa supply medical oxygen to health clinics and hospitals. Johnson & Johnson Impact Ventures is sponsoring Impact Alpha's coverage of investments in health for underserved communities. Corporate buyers are creating demand for green solutions. By committing in advance to purchase sustainable aviation fuel or captured carbon, companies like American Airlines and Microsoft are helping suppliers scale up and drive down costs. On Impact Alpha's Agents of Impact call earlier this week, Breakthrough Energy's Jonah Goldman explained how their billion-dollar Catalyst Fund is helping broker such off-take agreements.
The fundamental problem is the fact that the technologies that we're using right now are non-differentiated from the technologies that we want in their primary purpose. And so let's take sustainable aviation fuel. Obviously, the only true value once you actually get fuel into a plane is that the plane stays flying and lands and runs as we want it to. So the sustainability part of sustainable aviation fuel is not particularly important once you get it in the plane.
Employee-owned businesses have outperformed in the pandemic in pay, benefits, and workplace safety. Employees that own a stake in their worker-owned companies, like King Arthur Flour or Recology, have higher wages and net worth and lower unemployment in a downturn. In a guest post on Impact Alpha, Candida Fund's Diane Ives argued that helping businesses transition to employee ownership is among the most immediate ways impact investors can support workers and communities. And this was another big week of deals and fundraises. BioMilk raised $21 million for lab-grown, it says here, breast milk. 50 Years, the deep tech high-impact venture firm, raised $90 million for its third fund. Generation, the investment firm founded by Al Gore and David Blood, launched a spin-off company, Just Climate, to invest in solutions for hard-to-decarbonize heavy industries. And finally, Jay-Z's impact-focused investment firm Marcy Venture Partners closed its second fund at $325 million. Impact Alpha subscribers got all of these stories and more in their email each day this week. Speaking of big pimpin', now it's time for our roundtable discussion. COP26, the UN's climate conference, is taking place in the coming days in Glasgow, Scotland. David, isn't every COP supposed to be the most important COP ever? Why is this one important?
Well, yes, they're all important, until they're not, and it depends whether anything happens. This one is being touted as very important again, because in particular, the U.S. is back in the agreement that was struck at Paris after President Trump briefly pulled the U.S. out. So the expectations were, U.S. returns to climate leadership was the 6 month ago or so framing for this. And then more importantly, this was supposed to be the year, and this COP was supposed to take place last year, but was delayed because of the pandemic, 5 years after the Paris Agreement, that countries were going to ratchet up what's called their nationally determined contributions, or NDCs, as you'll hear in the next few days. As they got more comfortable with their clean energy transitions and other plans, as prices came down, they were going to have a big ratchet, as they said, of their plans, and then get their national plans in line with this goal of keeping temperature rise not just to the 2 degree that Paris called for, but to a 1.5 degrees Celsius increase that is the goal for, and the the requirement for averting a lot of, climate disaster. So, there's kind of tempered expectations going into it. People are saying there's sort of a global ambition gap. Things have to move faster, and all that. But hope springs eternal.
Hope springs eternal indeed, as our resident optimist, David. Now, Imogen, as our resident, let's say, person with a critical eye on some of these issues, what are you concerned about going into COP?
I mean, the obvious concern is, that nothing happens, right? That little or no consensus is reached, everyone falls out, and no progress is made. There's been a lot of discussion, for example, that, the Global South needs more support in achieving its climate goals, and that they were promised all this money and that none of it has come through. And so the UN is saying, in order for this COP to be successful, that has to be taken into account, that the poorer countries have to have a significant seat at the table, and there has to be support in terms of how we figure out how we're going to finance this clean energy transition. So I think the big concern is that those kind of conversations don't happen. I don't think Russia not being there is a particularly negative point, right? I don't think anyone's really worried about that. I think there's an outstanding question.
They're not worried because they didn't expect much anyway from them.
Well, exactly. And it's not like Russia's really shown itself to be, a good global player on the world stage. The US coming back is a huge deal. There's obviously a lot of concern and anxiety around what does that mean? What does Biden bring? What can he bring to the meeting? What can he offer? I think, the domestic, obviously, political concerns in the US severely restrict what the US can do. But I also think that the UK is really anxious for this to have a big win, right? They're politically incentivized to want this to succeed, to show that they can be a world player and show that they can do sort of something equal to Paris. The clearest line of sight available is, getting real pledges and real commitments around financing the green transition. And the likelihood is that a lot of that is going to have to come from the private sector, because the public sector doesn't have any money and lacks political will. So I think, to bring it full circle, you will see pressure on banks, pressures on allocators, pressures on investors to be the ones that step up and start providing this funding. And my concern is obviously that it's a lot of hot air and a lot of empty commitments that at the end of the day result in very little change.
And what happens if the commitments aren't made? Is it just kind of international egg on your face, or are there any kind of teeth to enforce these commitments?
No, there's I think no teeth as I understand it, other than, as you say, your own reputation. But I think that what was supposed to happen, and I frankly don't understand, well, I do know because we went through 4 years of resistance on this, but what was supposed to happen was that, as I said, the momentum towards the clean energy transition would gather so much speed that the goals set in Paris would seem not just, inadequate to the climate challenge, but sort of insufficient to the climate opportunity, because the incentives would all sort of swing to the other side. And there is some sense again, hope springs eternal, some sense that capital wants this transition to happen. There's so much to invest in, to retrofit, to rebuild, that there's just a sort of corporations want to get on the side of us. You saw all the GM announcements about electric vehicles and Hertz's purchase of 100,000 Teslas. I mean, the corporate side wants to get on with it. The finance side wants to get on with it. And then, as Imogen said, at least some governments, mostly UK, Europe, and others, want to get on with it. And the US, at least on paper, wants to get on with it. So when all that gets lined up, things could start to move very fast. It's just maybe not quite yet.
I do think there has been a momentum shift. I think that if you think about where we were in Paris and COP21 and where we are today, there has been a change. Like even with sort of four lost years of the Trump administration, if we think about how ESG has become part of the mainstream conversation, if you think about the successful activist campaign against Exxon, in an effort to force that company to pivot to renewables, something which nobody thought anyone could do. The fact that, like, you know, activist hedge fund manager Dan Loeb is now, you know, using the language of ESG in a campaign to get Shell to change its business. Like, these are not things that anyone was even thinking about 5 years ago. And so there's, you know, there's more investable opportunities. There is more incentive for people to act. So I think that there has been a temperament change. Does that result in? Does that lead to a successful COP? Much harder to tell. But I do think that, and is the transition happening fast enough? 100% no. But it does feel like at least that the train is pretty far out of the station at this point.
I think that's right, Imogen. And, you know, we talked before about humans being a storytelling animal, right? And we tell stories to each other. And I do think that the narrative around climate change has shifted fundamentally. I think, as to play on your train analogy, I do think the train has left the station. So the optimist take here is there's no going back to a pre-Paris world, right? The fundamental shifts have happened in the narrative that climate change is real and that there are real opportunities to make the changes necessary to avert the worst effects of global warming, even though we are already experiencing the serious effects of global warming today. It's a clear and present reality of our current situation. But I do think the fundamental dynamic has shifted, and that the future of finance will be sustainable finance. And I think that even if what comes out of this specific COP will inevitably be disappointing to many people who always want to see more action, and I would put myself in that category. But I think that we need to take the big picture perspective and say that the fundamental realignment of the economy and of policy is moving in fundamentally the right direction. And so even if there might be one step back, we are going 2 steps forward overall. But Imogen, you always help bring us back to earth and ground us in the reality. So where do you see this moving?
Look, I think the problem is we took a massive step back with Trump, right? We lost really another 4 years of, you know, I think the low point was probably, you know, the COP in Poland, where they have like 4-mile long shafts for coal mines, right? Like we lost 4 years really of momentum and pressure to finance the climate transition. So in a sense, this is really like a make or break meeting for the whole COP mission, because it has to show the relevancy of the COP to the process. And so that makes it really sort of vital that something tangible comes out of this.
And David, where do you see, you know, there are lots of different actors involved in COP, and where do you see the greatest room for movement coming?
Well, like Imogen said, the UK has staked out a big leadership position, not just because they're the host of the meeting, but because their climate plan is, I think, among the most ambitious in the world. And in fact, they've reduced their greenhouse gas emissions quite significantly already. And Europe is also quite aggressive. And then the Biden pledge to reductions is not quite as ambitious as either the European or the UK, but certainly a big step, even a big step beyond where President Obama was. So the ambitions are ramping up. The other thing I would say, which bears some just notice, and things obviously haven't moved fast enough or not moving fast enough. But when we were back at the Paris timeframe, the projections were that the world was headed towards something like a 4-degree Celsius increase. Now we're headed towards something like a 2.7 degree Celsius increase. So again, not as low as either the 2 degrees, and certainly not at the 1.5 degrees. But it does show that concerted effort, global effort, continued investment, continued innovation can bend the curve, and we can make headway. The greenhouse gas emissions globally are still going up, but they're not going up as fast. Once they start going down again, sort of the only hope left is once they start going down, they can go down very quickly.
I mean, the counterpoint to that, right, is the global response to COVID, minus Texas and Florida, demonstrates that the world can move quickly when called upon to do so. We choose not to when it comes to climate change, because even though the effects are being felt, we're basically a frog in boiling water, and we choose only to do it incrementally, and likely will not get our act together fast enough until there are more COVID, which there will be because of climate change. So I'm not as optimistic on that one.
I want to just make the other obvious point, which is that, the politics of this are in some sense lagging. As you said, Brian, the future is sort of clear, but the politics haven't quite caught up. And, we saw that in the U.S. with the opposition of one senator to, what would be more far-reaching climate proposals. And there's obviously opposition in other countries, when things happen or if gas prices happen to go up or what have you. But the real politics and younger generations and whatnot are all moving towards, much more aggressive action. And I think there's kind of a lag moment here before the dam breaks and the pressure, to move faster, gets even stronger. So, again, you got to hope for something.
Look, I don't think it's one senator from West Virginia that's holding the Democrats back from a massive win in climate policy. I think that he actually gives cover to a lot of other potential senators and congressional representatives who are not necessarily as comfortable.
Well, not to mention the 50 people in the other party. No, I didn't mean to say it was just one. I'm just saying as a representation that there is resistance.
I think it's an important point, because if you look at the electoral map, I don't see how the Democratic Party holds the Senate and passes the type of climate change legislation that's needed, because so many states have a large dependency on fossil fuels. And so I think that the political realities, and maybe you say, okay, so Democrats keep the White House and the House and they lose the Senate and you get there that way. But I think the political election chess of how this plays out is actually very difficult for Democrats.
I don't disagree with any of that. I'm just saying that you got to sort of build a constituency behind the new thing so that it can appear to be and in fact really be the better alternative, not just for some elite enviros as it used to be considered, but actually the path forward for the whole economy, for good jobs and everything else. And that politics has to get built, and then it has to become obviously the majority and the supermajority political strain. I'm not saying we're there yet, obviously.
And as long as we're piling on the challenges, that's just in the U.S. There's still China, which has become the world's largest emitter of greenhouse gases, and they have their own energy crisis going on, and they are probably coming out against a net zero emissions target by 2050. I think they did commit to 2060, but not to 2050. India, also a big polluter. Russia, as we've covered as well. So it's not just the challenges of a certain senator from the state of West Virginia in the U.S. There are among the biggest emitters lots of challenges all over the world.
I heard former Vice President Gore the other day quote what I hadn't known the name of. I had sort of known the concept, Dornbusch's law. Apparently, there's a German economist named Rudi Dornbusch whose precept says things always take longer than you expect for them to happen, but once they do, they move more quickly than you ever thought they could.
Oh, I like that.
That's Dornbusch's law.
Well, it sounds like this conversation took longer than expected, but I think it's actually moved along quite faster than I expected.
Not quite right, but sure.
Well, that's going to do it for your Impact Briefing this week. Thank you so much, David and Imogen.
Thank you.
Thank you both.
More all day, every day at impactalpha.com. Subscribe to get full access to the site and the daily newsletter brief. Podcast listeners get $100 off their first year subscription. Go to impactalpha.com/subscribe and use the code briefing100. Thank you for listening, and thank you to Imogen Roosmith and David Bank, as well as our fearless producer, Isaac Silk. I'm Brian Walsh, head of sustainability for the capital markets firm TP ICAP. Until next time, take good care.